They said he jumped. But the places his body passed through tell a very different story. Night had already settled over Beijing when the first rumors began to surface. Not the kind that spread loudly or openly, but the kind that moved quietly from one private message to another, whispered between people who understand the cost of speaking too clearly. On paper, the case appeared simple. A young actor. A fall from a height. An unfortunate but unremarkable ending. The official language was clean, efficient, and final. Yet almost immediately, something about the story refused to stay still. Yu Menglong was not unknown. He was not forgotten. He was, by all public measures, a rising figure whose career had not yet reached its peak. That fact alone did not prove anything. Accidents do not discriminate. But in the days following his death, attention shifted away from how he died and toward where he had been. And once that question was asked, it did not stop multiplying. 3 locations began to circulate online, always in the same order, always mentioned with caution. A luxury hotel known for privacy and silence. A cluster of corporate offices removed from public scrutiny. And finally, an art district celebrated for creativity, abstraction, and freedom of expression. None of these places were listed in any official report. None of them were acknowledged by authorities. Yet they appeared again and again in messages sent anonymously to bloggers, commentators, and overseas channels. According to those messages, Yu Menglong did not die where the public was told he did. He was moved. More than once. We are not presented with photographs or documents. What we are given instead are patterns. Claims that security footage disappeared during critical hours. Reports that entire sections of a building were closed under the justification of routine maintenance. Accounts from unnamed individuals who said they heard a voice that night, weak and desperate, calling out for release. No single detail stands on its own. Together they form a shape that is difficult to ignore. As the discussion spread, another unsettling detail emerged. Yu Menglong was not the only artist connected to his agency whose death had raised questions. Over less than a decade, several young performers had died under circumstances described as accidents. Falls, crashes, sudden medical events. Each case was handled separately. None were linked. At least not officially. This is usually where such stories fade. Fear has a way of exhausting attention. Silence follows. But in this case, silence only made the unanswered questions louder. People began asking why certain locations seemed to repeat. Why so much effort appeared to be spent controlling physical spaces rather than explaining events. And why a single name kept resurfacing whenever those questions were asked. An art zone. A number. A place that by daylight represents culture and modernity. By night, according to some, something else entirely. And the first place his name was whispered was not a hospital, nor a crime scene, but a luxury hotel. In the early hours following Yu Menglong's death, attention did not move toward hospitals or police stations. Instead, it drifted toward a building designed for discretion. A place where privacy is not merely a service, but a promise. The Bulgari Hotel in Beijing is known for silence, controlled access, and a clientele accustomed to not being seen. It is also the first location that appeared in the messages that began circulating beyond China's borders. According to one anonymous account, Yu Menglong had been at the hotel on the night of September 10th. This alone would not have raised suspicion. What followed, however, did. A guest reported hearing a voice from the spa area late that night. Not shouting, not arguing. A voice pleading, "Please let me go." The claim cannot be verified. There is no recording. But the account spread quickly, repeated by others who said they, too, had heard something unusual. Shortly after, another detail emerged. The hotel closed for several days. The explanation given was routine maintenance and sanitation. Entire rooms were reportedly demolished. Surveillance data from that night was said to have been erased. Employees were instructed not to speak. None of this was confirmed publicly. None of it was denied either. When questions are met with silence, speculation thrives. The next location mentioned in the anonymous messages was a technology company in Jiangsu province. The narrative suggested that Yu Menglong had been transferred there after the incident at the hotel. Why a private company would be involved was never explained. No photographs surfaced. No witnesses stepped forward under their own names. Yet the story persisted, repeating the same sequence, as though following a script that could not be altered. From there, the messages claimed he was moved again. This time to a high-end residential complex. Sunshine, Upper East. It was here, according to the rumor, that the fall occurred. The death scene presented to the public. A tragic accident. A closed case. But if this was the end, then the story would have ended with it. Instead, it continued downward. The final location named was not a residence, nor a hospital. It was a basement, specifically beneath a building inside the 798 Art Zone, a place associated with galleries, exhibitions, and public culture. The claim was that Yu Menglong's body had been taken there and placed in cold storage. Whether temporarily or permanently was left unclear. What mattered to those spreading the story was not the detail itself, but the implication. A body moved after death. A location never mentioned in official timelines. At this point, disbelief was expected. But then patterns began to surface. Researchers and commentators compiled a list of artists connected to the same media company. Over fewer than 10 years, at least 9 had died. The causes varied. Car accidents, falls from buildings, sudden illnesses. Each case was treated as isolated. Each explanation on its own seemed plausible. Together, they formed a statistical anomaly that many found difficult to dismiss. We are not presented with proof. We are presented with repetition. Another claim soon followed, one that widened the scope of the story significantly. The Bulgari Hotel, according to some netizens, was not merely a hotel. It was allegedly connected by underground passages to nearby facilities, including a major military hospital and the 798 Art Zone itself. The implication was chilling. Bodies could be moved without being seen. People could enter and exit without leaving a trace. This is where the narrative becomes most dangerous and most revealing. The suggestion that hospitals could be involved raised immediate fears of organ harvesting. It is an accusation with a long and controversial history, one that cannot be made lightly. And yet, it continues to resurface in discussions surrounding unexplained deaths, secret detention, and vanished individuals. The hotel, the hospital, the art district. 3 spaces that on the surface share nothing in common. Below ground, according to these claims, they form a closed circuit. What makes these stories persist is not their extremity, but the absence of transparent refutation. No press conference addressed the alleged closures. No footage was released to confirm or deny the destruction of hotel rooms. No official timeline accounted for Yu Menglong's movements before his death. In the vacuum left by silence, imagination fills the gaps. It is important to pause here. At this stage, we are still in the visible world. Buildings, cameras, schedules, human witnesses. Everything described so far exists within physical reality. It may be distorted, it may be exaggerated, but it does not yet rely on belief, only on access. And access in this case appears tightly controlled. As the public searched for answers, something else became clear. The story was not being suppressed uniformly. Some platforms deleted content immediately. Others allowed it to spread briefly before throttling engagement. Comments appeared and vanished. Accounts were warned or banned. The inconsistency suggested not a single hand, but several, pulling in different directions. That inconsistency would soon become a story of its own. But before the system revealed its fractures, attention shifted again. Away from cameras and corridors, away from physical movement, toward something far more unsettling. Because if Yu Menglong's body had been moved so carefully, some began to ask, then what about the part of him that could not be contained? If this was an accident, then why were so many doors locked, so many cameras erased, and so many witnesses told to forget? When physical explanations reached their limits, the conversation shifted. Not outward, but inward. Away from corridors, cameras, and security logs, and toward a framework that does not rely on access or documentation. A framework built on symbols, repetition, and belief. This is where the number began to matter. 7, 9, 8. At first glance, 798 appears ordinary. An industrial code. A district designation. A convenient label for an art zone repurposed from old factories. Yet among those who study numerology, Taoist cosmology, and esoteric traditions, such sequence are rarely dismissed as accidental. According to several commentators, the number 7 corresponds to celestial order, often associated with the Big Dipper and its role in governing life cycles. 8 represents balance, stability, and structural harmony through the 8 trigrams. 9, the highest single digit, is seen as the extreme of yang energy, associated with completion, authority, and domination. Individually, these interpretations prove nothing. Together, they form a symbolic system that some believe can be used not only to represent power, but to impose it. Within this framework, a theory began to circulate. It suggested that the 798 art zone was not merely a cultural space, but a deliberate spatial construct. According to this interpretation, the physical layout of the area mirrored cosmological patterns. Movement through its corridors, transitions between buildings, and shifts in direction were said to replicate the flow of energy described in ancient texts. Art in this context was not decoration. It was camouflage. We must be careful here. These claims are not supported by architectural plans or institutional admissions. They originate from individuals who describe themselves as practitioners or long-term students of occult systems. Their arguments rely on pattern recognition rather than evidence. Yet the persistence of these ideas reveals something important. People were no longer trying to prove what happened. They were trying to understand why it felt unresolved. One concept appeared repeatedly in these discussions: soul displacement. In various shamanic and esoteric traditions, it is believed that a soul can be destabilized by disrupting its sense of orientation. Constant changes in location, shifts in sound and environment, movement without rest. The purpose, according to these beliefs, is not punishment, but control. A disoriented soul is said to be easier to dominate, easier to bind, and less capable of returning to a place of safety. Within this logic, the repeated movement of Yu Menglong's body took on a different meaning. Not logistical, but ritualistic. Each transfer between locations was interpreted as a deliberate act, a way to prevent something from settling. Another element soon entered the discussion: footwear. Some messages described red threads tied to shoes, small metallic pins hidden within the fabric. The claim was that these objects served as anchors, tools used to bind a soul to the physical world, preventing it from escaping or seeking resolution. Similar motifs appear across cultures, often associated with funerary practices or forbidden rites. In most traditions, such acts are considered deeply unethical, reserved only for extreme circumstances or acts of malice. No photographs confirm these details. What circulated instead were blurred images, open to interpretation. To skeptics, they proved nothing. To believers, they proved enough. The art itself also became suspect. Certain installations within the 798 district were described not as aesthetic expressions, but as symbolic structures. Chairs positioned in commanding orientations. Objects arranged in ways that suggested hierarchy rather than creativity. According to one interpretation, these were not random choices. They were markers, points of authority, visual representations of control embedded within a public space. The most unsettling claim, however, involved what lay beneath. Some suggested that an altar existed below the galleries, hidden from view, accessible only through restricted areas. The exhibitions above ground, they argued, were not separate from this space. They were part of a single installation, a continuation of something older, something never meant to be documented. It is here that the narrative risks collapsing under its own weight. And yet, it is also here that it gains power, because none of these ideas require belief to have impact. They only require uncertainty. We are not asked to accept that rituals occurred. We are asked to confront the possibility that the official story leaves too much unexplained. When institutions refuse to clarify timelines, when physical evidence disappears, and when patterns repeat without acknowledgement, alternative explanations thrive. Some are rational, others are symbolic. All of them fill a void left by silence. As one commentator cautiously stated, these interpretations were personal views. Stories, a way of framing the unknown. Those who did not believe were free to dismiss them. But for those who did, the conclusion was already forming. If the body had been moved to prevent discovery, then the ritual theory explained why. Not to hide what happened, but to control what followed. And that raised a final question, one that could not be answered through architecture, numerology, or belief systems alone. If the soul had been bound, displaced, or denied rest, then was it truly silent? Because in the weeks that followed, some claimed it was still answering. But if these rituals were real, then one question remained. Was the soul still there? By the time discussion reached its most speculative phase, many expected the story to dissolve. Without documents or witnesses willing to stand in the light, attention usually fades. In this case, it did the opposite. The absence of confirmation pushed the narrative into a space where proof was no longer the objective. Contact was. Weeks after Yu Menglong's death, a YouTube channel based in Taiwan released footage that immediately reignited the controversy. The hosts did not claim to be investigators or journalists. They described themselves as archivists of unresolved cases. Their method was simple and deeply polarizing. They attempted to communicate with what they believed to be Yu Menglong's spirit using an electronic voice phenomenon device. EVP has long existed at the border between science and belief. Supporters argue that electronic equipment can capture frequencies beyond human hearing. Critics counter that such recordings are vulnerable to interference, suggestion, and selective interpretation. Both sides agree on one point. EVP does not produce certainty. It produces debate. In their first session, the hosts asked basic questions. Questions whose answers, they claimed, could be verified independently. Where he was born, who had harmed him, what he wanted his fans to know. According to the hosts, the responses were clear. Too clear in the eyes of skeptics. Clips circulated rapidly before being removed or restricted on certain platforms. Viewers argued over what they heard. Some heard names. Others heard noise. Many heard nothing at all. The second session drew even more attention. This time the questions went further. Was there a suicide note that had been erased? Would he attend a memorial ritual planned by his mentor? Were the remains of Yu Menglong and another deceased artist hidden inside the 798 art zone? The answers, according to the hosts, came back fragmented, distorted, and deeply unsettling. One word stood out: Chihao. To believers, the reference was immediate. Chihao Art Museum. The same location that had been mentioned in anonymous messages weeks earlier. To skeptics, it was coincidence, a sound shaped by expectation, a syllable imposed on static. Both interpretations existed simultaneously, neither able to disprove the other. When asked whether another artist had died under similar treatment, the recorded response was described as fearful. Not descriptive, not explanatory, simply emotional. The hosts emphasized that their equipment could not guarantee accuracy. They repeatedly stated that viewers should judge for themselves. This disclaimer did little to slow the reaction. The question of timing soon followed. A British psychic had previously suggested that the truth surrounding the case would surface in October. When asked to specify a date, the EVP response was interpreted as the 18th. This detail spread rapidly, not because of its credibility, but because of its precision. Specific dates create anticipation. Anticipation keeps stories alive. Criticism came swiftly. Scientists dismissed the sessions as auditory pareidolia. Viewers accused the hosts of exploiting grief. Others defended them, arguing that silence benefits only those who fear scrutiny. The hosts themselves remained consistent in one message. If the case was allowed to disappear, then no answer would ever come. As this debate unfolded, something unexpected happened. The story began to fracture from within. Behind the scenes, individuals working inside China's content moderation system started to speak. One moderator, later identified as having worked for a major video platform, reportedly fled the country and revealed internal conflicts between two powerful state agencies. According to the whistleblower, directives surrounding the Yu Menglong case were contradictory. One department demanded total suppression. Another instructed platforms to allow limited exposure, particularly content referencing the 798 art zone. The result was chaos. Videos appeared briefly, then vanished. Comment sections were throttled. Users saw one comment every 30 minutes. Entire discussions froze in place. The inconsistency suggested not a unified strategy, but a struggle for control. Power confronting power. Each fearing the consequences of silence and exposure alike. The whistleblower described years of emotional exhaustion. Reviewing political content. Enforcing silence. Manipulating visibility. For a small monthly bonus, they participated in a system that rewarded compliance and punished conscience. When the Yu Menglong case erupted, the internal contradictions became impossible to manage. According to the account, one side feared that the case could be interpreted as a challenge to authority. The other saw value in redirecting attention, allowing certain narratives to circulate while burying others. Neither approach worked. The story adapted. It moved across borders, into language and platforms beyond immediate reach. What began as a question about a single death had transformed into something else entirely. A reflection of a system struggling to contain information. A reminder that control is never absolute. And a demonstration of how unresolved cases evolve when truth is delayed. At this point, belief becomes irrelevant. Whether the EVP recordings captured a voice or only noise, their impact was real. They prolonged attention. They disrupted silence. They forced institutions to react. In that sense, the voice mattered not because of what it said, but because it refused to disappear. And as pressure mounted, fractures within the system widened. Leaks surfaced. Agencies accused one another. A secret bureau emerged publicly, not to protect secrets from outsiders, but to stem the flow from within. The image of unity began to erode, which leaves us here. Between belief and skepticism, between noise and meaning, between a system that insists on forgetting and a public that refuses to let go. Because sometimes the most dangerous voice is not the one that speaks from beyond. It is the one that exposes how fragile silence really is. And just as the questions grew louder, something inside the system began to break. At some point, every unresolved case reaches a quiet threshold. Not because answers are found, but because the questions become too uncomfortable to pursue openly. The death of Yu Menglong crossed that threshold long ago. What followed was not closure, but accumulation. Of doubts, of contradictions, of silences that spoke louder than statements ever could. Officially, there is nothing left to investigate. A fall. A conclusion. A name archived. Yet outside formal records, the story continues to circulate, reshaped by fragments that were never addressed. A hotel that closed without explanation. Surveillance that no longer exists. Locations that appear repeatedly, but are never acknowledged. None of these details prove wrongdoing on their own. Together they suggest something more troubling than a single crime. They suggest a system that prefers erasure to explanation. We are not here to confirm rituals or deny them. Claims involving numerology, soul binding, or spiritual displacement remain unverified, rooted in belief rather than documentation. But belief does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows where transparency fails. When institutions offer no coherent narrative, people search for meaning elsewhere. Sometimes in symbols. Sometimes in voices recorded through static. Sometimes in stories that feel closer to truth than official silence. What makes this case significant is not whether a soul answered through an electronic device. It is the reaction that followed. Content removed, then selectively allowed. Comment sections restricted. Conflicting directives issued behind closed doors. A whistleblower stepping forward, not to reveal secrets from outside pressure, but to expose fractures within the machinery itself. For a system built on control of information, inconsistency is a warning sign. As internal agencies turned against one another, the image of unity began to crack. The emergence of previously hidden bureaus into public view was framed as protection. In reality, it revealed fear. Fear not of foreign interference, but of leaks from within. Of narratives that could no longer be contained. of stories that refuse to die quietly. Yu Menglong's case now exists in a space beyond resolution. It is no longer just about one actor, one fall, or one disputed timeline. It has become a mirror, reflecting how power responds when certainty dissolves, how silence is enforced, and how quickly alternative explanations arise when trust is lost. We are left then not with answers but with responsibility, to distinguish evidence from speculation, to question narratives that close too neatly, and to remember that the absence of truth is not neutrality. It is a choice. Perhaps nothing supernatural occurred. Perhaps no ritual was ever performed. Perhaps every rumor will one day be disproven. Even if that is the case, one fact remains unchanged. This story persisted because it was never properly confronted, because those with the authority to explain chose not to. And that is why the case endures. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not a ghost. It is a system that refuses to let the dead speak.